So we're going to continue our conversation about the location of places and different ways we can describe the location of places. And so now we're going to talk about site and situation. Site and situation are two ways that we can describe the place itself. Really, and we talk about site and situation, we talk about the characteristics of the place and really what make it distinct from some of the other places. And situation gets a little bit more in depth, and we'll talk about that in just a second. So when we talk about site, we're talking about the internal physical and cultural characteristics of a place. So if we're looking at a place on the map, well, when we look at site, we want to examine what's going on inside of that space. So not just looking at the location itself, but actually what's going on in that particular location and how that's going to be unique compared to other locations around it. So I have a couple of picture examples here, mainly of physical features in some of the wildlife in certain places. Like so in Eastern Africa, Kenya, we have Mount Kilimanjaro in the background there, and we have the savanna grasslands with the giraffe. And you think about how is the climate going to play a role in the different type of topography in the landscape, and then of course how is that going to impact the people and how is that going to affect their culture and things along those lines. But we have Mount Kilimanjaro, a very unique place within Eastern Africa, and makes that place in Kenya unique to other places on the eastern portion of Africa and even the continent as a whole. Then you look down the lower left, we have here the Andes Mountains in the background. This is a picture in Argentina, the Andes Mountains in the background. And then in the foreground, you have the horses. So, again, another shot of the wildlife with the topography in the background. You think about how the high elevation is going to impact the environment and how that's going to impact the people that are living there. Another thing that's interesting here, you see down at the bottom, it says horses in Argentina with a question mark. You look at the horses here, and those of you who are familiar with history know that horses are not indigenous to South America. And so then the question is, well, how in the world did horses get to South America? Certainly they didn't swim across the ocean because horses originated in Spain. And so you have the situation where the conquistadors actually brought horses over to South America as they were conquering portions of North America, Central America, and South America. And so that has changed the landscape, both the cultural landscape and also the physical and the ecological landscape of South America. And even in some portions of South America, we really connect the horse with certain cultures and people and the things that they're doing. And so we find out that that doesn't happen until much later on, the 1500s or so, when the Spanish are coming over. And so that also is going to be a part of that element of globalization that we're talking about when different animals and species and humans are going to be changing the environment based upon their interactions and what they're bringing over. Another element we have here, this is a map, and we'll be looking at some more maps as we go throughout the year. This is what we call a proportional symbol map, and it's talking about the Islamic population around the world. And so this would be helpful in terms of a conversation of looking at the specific cultural characteristics. Of course, Islamic population, we're talking about religion, and you think about how is religion going to impact not just the cultural landscape, but also things maybe like the physical landscape, whether it's the things that they will or the Muslims will or will not allow to happen in landscape. Certain animals won't be raised and consumed. We have a little talk about that later on culture. You can talk about the cultural landscape with the certain types of buildings that will be built. Certainly the mosque will be built and things along those lines with the particular characteristics that are unique to the mosque. The dress is going to be different. And even as you look across the world and you look at the different Muslims that are living in different parts of the world, they are even going to vary in terms of what traditional cultural elements they bring to Islam, whether we're talking about those from West Africa or from East Asia, as far as Indonesia, which is actually the country with the largest Muslim population in the world. And so, of course, this is going to be important because Islam is our second fastest growing, actually, it's the fastest growing religion in the world today, the second largest religion in the world today. And so you look at that, and that helps you, Islam would help you to understand what is going on in that particular place. So that would be a way that you could describe the site of particular countries around the world. Then when we look at situation is a little bit different. It's more along the lines of relative location. We are still looking at the physical and cultural characteristics of a place, but we're looking at the location, the importance of a location relative to the elements around it, whether it's the physical or the cultural characteristics that exist around that particular place, and how it's going to influence that particular place. So not necessarily talking about the place itself, but the things that exist around that particular place. So very similar to relative location, we're talking about the things that are relative to that specific place, things that are going on around it. How are the things that are going on around it going to impact that particular place, or what makes it significant? So a couple of examples we can look at. So you have the state of New York. You think about New York City and its prosperity, and you think about the role that it plays culturally, economically in the United States. And you begin to understand a little bit better what's going on with New York. If you and I would maybe I should have had a map that showed a little bit more of the region. But you have some important elements, especially some important physical elements, being that New York City has a nice harbor that can that facilitates trade. It's also right along the Hudson River, which is going to allow trade to be brought down from upstate New York. And so that's going to that's going to bring a tremendous amount of bearing on what has allowed for New York City to be such an important become an important city, and a lot of that has to do with the trade that allowed for because of its natural physical location along the Atlantic Ocean there. If we look at something like Israel and bring these two situations up because of some of the current conflicts that are going on in our world today, if you want to understand the situation of Israel and the conflict in the Middle East, then it's not just Israel itself that sits in isolation, but it's also Israel that's kind of not encapsulated, but is surrounded by the other Arab countries in the entire Middle East. And so there is some conflict that has existed between Israel and the other Arab states historically. And so maybe that helps you to understand a little bit why Israel sometimes reacts the way that it does. But you can't just think of Israel in isolation by itself. You have to think about it in relationship to the other cultures and countries that exist around it. Or if we look at something like the Ukraine, the conflict that has existed for the last, maybe it's been about a year or so, between the Ukraine and Russia. And you have the Russian separatist movement going on in eastern Ukraine. Of course, Crimea voted for independence. So lots of interesting things going on there, but you look at Ukraine in relationship to Russia, and you think historically what's been happening there. And this map right here shows you populations that speak Russian as their native language, so that would give you an idea that maybe they are ethnically Russian or historically Russian in their families, and they might have tendencies towards pro-Russian feelings. And so it's not just Ukraine sitting off by itself, but it's also Ukraine in relationship to Russia and why some of these things are happening. And of course, understanding the history of Ukraine and its relationship to Russia as a part of the Soviet Union, the Russian Empire, things are also important. But then also understanding maybe of the West, especially like Poland and some of the Baltic states, their concerns is the Russian Ukrainian crisis gets amped up. Why they become concerned, because you see that they are right next to also Russia, but also to Ukraine and some of those separatist feelings that are beginning to stir. So it's not just about Ukraine in isolation, but it's Ukraine in relationship to its in relationship to Russia and where it is located. And of course, this eastern portion being closest to Russia, which would might encourage some of those separatists, but also would help you understand why you have people who are historically of Russian ethnic descent that are living in those particular portions of the country. So that's our discussion on location. We had absolute location, relative location, site and situation. And so next we'll be moving on to, in our next video, we'll be moving on to human environment interaction as our next discussion on the 5 themes of geography.